So starting on page 226, and it's the 24th um, discourse titled Selfishness. So I'll just get the ball rolling for a page or two. Selfishness comes into existence because of the human desire to find fulfillment in action and experience. It is born of ignorance about one's own nature. And because human consciousness is clouded by the accumulation of impressions deposited in the long course of the evolution of consciousness. These impressions, or sanskaras, express themselves as desires, and the range of consciousness is limited by them, for they form an enclosure around the field of consciousness. Within the circle of sanskaras is the area within which the individual consciousness is focused. Some desires are latent, but others translate themselves into action. The capacity of desire to find expression in conduct depends upon the intensity and amount of the sanskaras. To use a geometrical metaphor, when a desire passes into action, it traverses a distance that is equal to the radius of a circle, describing the boundary of the sanskaras connected with it. The range of selfishness is equal to the range of desires. Owing to the hindrance of innumerable desires, it becomes impossible for the soul to find free and full expression of its true being, and life becomes self-centered and narrow. The entire life of the personal ego is continually in the grip of wanting. That is, it attempts to seek fulfillment of desires through things that change, but there can be no fulfillment through transient things. The satisfaction derived from the fleeting things of life is fleeting, and the wants of man remain unfulfilled. There is thus a general sense of dissatisfaction accompanied by every kind of worry. The chief forms in which the frustrated ego finds expression are lust, greed, and anger. Lust is like greed in many respects, but differs in the manner of its fulfillment, which is directly related to the physical sphere. Lust finds its expression through the physical body and is concerned with the flesh. It is a form of entanglement with the physical sphere. Greed is the restlessness of the heart and consists mainly of craving for power and possessions sought for the fulfillment of desires. Man is only partially satisfied in the attempt to fulfill his desires, and this partial satisfaction increases the flame of craving instead of extinguishing it. So greed always finds an endless field of conquest and leaves man endlessly dissatisfied. The chief expressions of greed are related to the emotions. They are a form of entanglement with the subtle or psychic sphere. Anger is the fume of an irritated mind caused by the thwarting of desires. It feeds the limited ego in its aim for domination and aggression. It aims at removing the obstacles to the fulfillment of desires. The frenzy of anger nourishes egoism and is the greatest benefactor of the limited ego. Mind is the seat of anger, and its expressions are mostly through the activities of the mind. Anger is a form of mental entanglement. Lust, greed, and anger respectively have body, heart, and mind as their vehicles of expression. Man experiences disappointment through lust, greed, and anger, and the frustrated ego seeks further gratification through them. Consciousness is thus caught up in a circle of endless disappointment, which comes into existence when either lust, greed, or anger are thwarted in their expression. It is a general reaction of the gross, subtle, and mental entanglements, a depression caused by the non-fulfillment of lust, greed, and anger, which together are coextensive with selfishness. Selfishness, which is the common basis of these three vices, is thus the ultimate cause of disappointment and worries. It defeats itself. It seeks fulfillment through desires, but succeeds only in increasing unsatisfied desires. Rosalie.
I have a request. I need to see the first two sentences of this selfishness while we're not so far along. I don't know, those first two sentences just really spoke to me. Selfishness comes.
Go ahead and read them, Rosalie. And
selfishness comes into existence because of the human desire to find fulfillment in action and experience. It is born of ignorance about one's own nature, and because human consciousness is clouded by the accumulation of impressions deposited in the long course of the evolution of consciousness. But just that one, it's so, okay, selfishness comes into existence because of the human desire. But that's so mind-blowing. The human desire to find, wait a minute.
Rosalie, we're reading actually. We're not like doing a study group. So I think your questions, you can answer them yourself when we're done reading, please. Do you want to read from here or should somebody else read?
From here? Is this where we're reading from? Yeah.
Yes.
Selfishness inevitably leads to dissatisfaction and disappointment because desires are endless. The problem of happiness is, therefore, the problem of surrendering desires. Desires, however, cannot be overcome by repressing them. They can be annihilated only through knowledge. If you enter deeply into the realm of thought and think seriously for a few minutes, you will realize the emptiness of desires. Think of what you have enjoyed for many years and what you have suffered. Does it not all amount to nothing? Are not all your sufferings throughout life also nothing? All was illusion. It is your right to be happy. Yet you created your own unhappiness by wanting things. Wanting is the source of perpetual restlessness. If you did not get the thing you wanted, you were disappointed. And if you did get it, you wanted more and more of it and remain unhappy. Say, I do not want anything, and be happy. The continuous realization of the futility of wants will eventually lead you to knowledge, which will give you freedom from wants and lead you towards abiding happiness. Renunciation of wants. Wants should be distinguished from needs. Pride and anger, greed and lust are different from need. You may think, I need all that I want. But this is a mistake. If you are thirsty in a desert, what you need is water. As long as man has a body, there will be needs, and it is necessary to meet them. But wants are a product of imagination. They must be scrupulously killed if there is to be happiness. But as the very being of selfishness consists of desires, renunciation of wants becomes a process of death. Dying in the ordinary sense means parting with the physical body, but dying in the spiritual sense means renunciation of sense desires. The priests prepare men for false death by pictures of hell and heaven. But death is an illusion, since life is an unbroken continuity. The true death consists of the cessation of desires and comes by gradual stages. The dawn of love facilitates the death of selfishness. Being is dying by loving. If you cannot love one another, how can you love those who torture you? The limits of selfishness are created by ignorance. When a man realizes that he can have a more glorious satisfaction by widening the sphere of his interest and activities, he is heading toward the life of service. At this stage, he entertains many good desires. He wants to make others happy by relieving distress and helping them. And though even in good desires, there is often an indirect and latent reference to the self, selfishness has no grip over good deeds. I repeat that. Selfishness has no grip over good deeds. Even good desires may be said to be a form of enlightened and extended selfishness. For, like bad desires, they too move within the domain of duality. But in entertaining good desires, selfishness eventually brings about its own extinction. Instead of trying to be luminous, arrestive, and possessive, man learns to be useful to others. The desires that enter into the constitution of the personal ego are either good or bad. Bad desires are ordinarily referred to as forms of selfishness, and good desires as forms of selflessness. But no hard and fast line divides selfishness from selflessness. Both are in the sphere of duality, and from the point of view that transcends the opposites of good and bad, selfishness and selflessness are two phases of the life of the personal ego. And the two phases are continuous. Selfishness arises when desires are centered upon the individuality. Selflessness arises when this crude organization of desires suffers disintegration. And there is a general dispersing of desires. Selfishness is the narrowing down of interest to a limited field. Selflessness, the extension of interest over a wide field. To put it paradoxically, selfishness is a restricted form of selfishness, and selflessness is the drawing out of selfishness into a wide sphere of activity.
Thanks, Rosalie. Marion, please.
Transformation of selfishness. Selfishness has to be transmuted into selflessness before the sphere of duality is transcended. Persistent and continuous performance of good deeds wears out selfishness. Selfishness extended and expressed in the form of good deeds becomes the instrument of its own destruction. The good is the link between selfishness, thriving, and dying. Selfishness, which in the beginning is the father of evil tendencies, becomes, through good deeds, the cause of its own defeat. And when evil tendencies are replaced by good tendencies, selfishness is transformed into selflessness. That is, individual selfishness loses itself in universal interest. And though this selfless and good life is also bound by the opposites, goodness is a necessary step towards freedom from the opposites. Goodness is the means of the soul to annihilate its own ignorance. From the good, the soul passes to God. The selfless is merged into the universal self, beyond good and bad, virtue and vice, and all other dual aspects of Maya. The height of selflessness is the beginning of the feeling of oneness with all. In the state of liberation, there is neither selfishness nor selflessness, for both are merged in selflessness for all. Realization of the unity of life is accompanied by peace and unfathomable bliss. It does not lead either to spiritual stagnation or to the obliteration of relative values. Selflessness for all brings about undisturbed harmony without loss of discrimination, and peace without indifference to surroundings. And this selflessness for all is not an outcome of mere subjective synthesis. It is a result of an attainment of union with the ultimate reality, which includes all. Open your heart by weeding out desires and by harboring only one longing, the longing for union with the ultimate reality. That ultimate reality is not to be sought in the changing external environment, but in one's own being. Every time your soul intends to enter your human heart, it finds the doors locked with the heart full of desires. Do not keep the doors of your heart closed. Everywhere there is present the source of abiding bliss. Yet all are miserable because of desires born of ignorance. The goal of happiness is reached only when the limited ego, with its desires, finds its extinction. Spirituality, a positive attitude to life. Renunciation of desires does not mean asceticism or a negative attitude to life. Negation of life would make man inhuman. Divinity is not devoid of humanity. Spirituality makes man more human. It is a positive release of the good, noble, and beautiful in man, and to what is gracious and lovely in the environment. It does not require renunciation of worldly activities or the avoiding of duties and responsibilities. It requires only that while engaging in worldly activities or discharging the responsibilities arising from the place and position of the individual, the inner spirit should be free from the burden of desires. Perfection consists in remaining free from the entanglements of duality. Such freedom is the essential requirement of unhindered creativity. But this freedom cannot be attained by running away from life for fear of entanglement with it. This would mean denial of life. Perfection does not consist in shrinking from the dual expressions of nature. To attempt to escape from entanglement implies fear of life. But spirituality consists in meeting life without being overpowered by the opposites. The free spirit asserts its dominion over all illusion, however attractive or powerful. Without avoiding contact with the different aspects of life, a perfect man functions with complete detachment in the midst of intense activity. Someone else to read. 25, violence and nonviolence. Nonviolence means love infinite. It is the goal of life. When pure and infinite love is reached, the aspirant is at one with God. To reach this goal, there must be intense longing, and the aspirant who has this longing has to begin by practicing the non-violence of the brave. This applies to those who, though not at one with all through realization, consider none to be their enemy and try to win over even the aggressor through love. They give up their lives through love, not through fear. Nonviolence of the brave is practicable for those who have the intense longing to attain the supreme state. This longing is not to be found in the majority. If, therefore, it is intended to lead the majority to nonviolence, it is necessary first to prepare them for the nonviolence of the brave. To achieve this in a practical way, it is necessary to make them follow, in the beginning, the principle of nonviolent violence. That is, violence done solely for defending the weak without any selfish motive. In times of war, when the masses are in the mood to listen to advice about having intense longing to attain the supreme goal of life, the only practical way to lead them towards the goal is to begin by inculcating in them the principle of non-violent violence, and then gradually introducing the non-violence of the brave. Otherwise, non-violence would not only fail, but there would be serious danger of the fatal non-violence of the coward. That is, non-resistance to aggression because of fear.
Thank you, Marian. Ernie, please.
The masses may also be led to the nonviolence of the brave by following the principles of selfless violence instead of those of nonviolent violence. This selfless violence is violence done in self-defense when attacked treacherously. No other motive should be allowed to justify the violence. Thus, for example, were a woman threatened with violation and one defends her by resorting to violence, he is said to have followed the principles of selfless violence. Similarly, when the motherland is being attacked by enemies, the nation's effort in defending the motherland is selfless violence. An element of selfishness being there, the love expressed is limited human love. Nonviolence of the coward is fatal. So also is selfish violence. That is, violence for selfish motives by individuals or a nation to gain power or for other selfish ends. It will therefore be seen that while nonviolence is the goal of life, this goal is to be attained by individual seekers of God by following nonviolence of the brave. The majority who have not the intense longing for being one with God have to be led towards this goal on the principles of nonviolent violence, or those of selfish violence, according to the circumstances. It must be very clearly understood that nonviolent violence and selfless violence are merely the means of attaining the goal of life, namely the pure and simple. Nonviolence or the love infinite. These means must not be confused with the goal itself. The motive and the result are determined by the acceptance of their being good or bad. For example, nonviolence of the brave and nonviolence of the coward are both nonviolence, but from the viewpoint of the motive force behind it, nonviolence of the brave is born of love, and nonviolence of the coward is born of fear, which is opposite to love. Although as nonviolence, they are not opposites, their motives are opposed. The motive behind nonviolence of the brave is losing one's life to gain infinite love, and the motive behind nonviolence of the coward is to save one's own life. So nonviolence of the coward we describe as non-love, as we describe nonviolence of the brave as love. Nonviolent violence is justified not as love, but as duty. Duty done selflessly for others, according to karma yoga, which is linked with unlimited love, but human love. Excuse me. The difference between these two opposite forces cannot be obliterated, but the transformation of one force to another can happen when expressed through the right channels. Food given wrongly becomes poison, but poison given in small quantities as a tonic may become food for the nerves. Indeed, all food is poison. It is only in the power of transformation that it becomes converted into good. We must live for God and die for God. War is a necessary evil. It is in God's plan to awaken humanity to higher values. If humanity fails to profit by the lessons of war, it suffers in vain. War teaches that even the man in the street can rise to the greatest heights of sacrifice for the sake of a selfless cause. It also teaches that wealth, possessions, power, fame, family, and even life on earth are devoid of lasting value. The incidents of war can, through the lessons they bring, win man for God and initiate him into a new life inspired by lasting values. In war, people make unlimited sacrifices and endure untold sufferings for the sake of their country. or in the interest of political aims. They are capable of the same sacrifices and endurance for God. All religions have unequivocally claimed man for life in the truth, and it is sheer folly to fight in the name of any religion. It is time for a fresh vision of the truth that all life is one, that only God is real, and that God is all that matters. God is worth dying for. He is also worth living for. All else is vain and empty, the pursuit of illusory values. "26. God and the individual. There is one being, the universal being. The existence of the finite is apparent or imaginary. You are infinite. You are everywhere. But you think you are the body and consider yourself limited. If you think you are the body, you do not know your true nature. If you would look within and experience your own self in its true nature, you would realize that you were infinite and beyond all creation. But you identify yourself with the body due to ignorance made effective through the medium of the mind. Man thinks himself to be the physical body. When spiritually advanced, he thinks him to be the psychic body. The saint thinks he is the mind. But in these thoughts, man does not experience self-knowledge. As spirit, man is infinite. But under the sway of the mind, he becomes a thinker or a saint. Sometimes identifying himself with the body, sometimes with the mind. From the point of view of one who has not gone beyond Maya, it seems that there are as many individuals as there are minds and bodies. In truth, there is one universal being. Behind the minds of seemingly different individuals, who through them has the experiences of duality.
Thanks, Ern. Rolf, are you able to read? You have to unmute. Elizabeth, are you still unable to read, or can you read now?
Okay, I'll read, but I have to be quiet again because
Alrighty.
I'm preparing for my sister.
Okay.
Okay. The curse, sorry, the cause of false thinking. Thinking becomes false owing to the interference of the sanskaras accumulated during the process of the evolution of consciousness, which manifest themselves as desires. Through many lives, consciousness is burdened by the after effects of experience, and the perception of the soul is limited. The soul cannot break through the hedge created by sanskaras, and consciousness becomes a helpless captive of illusions projected by its own false thinking. And this falsification of thought is present not only where consciousness is partly developed, but also in men who consider themselves to be fully developed. The progressive evolution of consciousness, beginning with the stone, culminates in man. The history of evolution is the history of a gradual development of consciousness, and the fruit of evolution is full consciousness, which is the particular characteristic of man. But even full consciousness is like a mirror covered by dust. For owing to the operation of sanskaras, it does not yield clear and true knowledge of the nature of the self. Though fully developed, it yields not truth, but an imaginary picture, because its functioning is hindered by the weight of the sanskaras. Moreover, it cannot extend beyond its desires and therefore is limited in its scope. The individuation of consciousness. The boundaries of consciousness are prescribed by the sanskaras, and its functioning determined by the desires. As desires aim at self-satisfaction, consciousness is self-centered. The individuation of consciousness may be said to be the effect of the vortex of desires. The soul gets enmeshed in desires and cannot rise out of the individuality constituted by them. I'll reread that. The soul gets enmeshed in desires and cannot rise out of the individuality constituted by them. It imagines barriers and becomes self-hypnotized. It looks upon itself as separate from other individuals. It gets entangled in individual existence and a world of separateness with many individuals and their minds and bodies. Separateness exists in imagination. When the rays of the sun pass through a prism, they are dispersed and separate through refraction. If each ray had consciousness, it would consider itself to be separate from the other rays, forgetting the other side of the prism. In the same way, the one being descends in the domain of Maya and assumes multiplicity. The separateness of individuals exists only in imagination. The one being imagines separateness, and out of this division, there arises I and mine opposed to you and yours. Although the individual is an undivided unity, it appears to be divided owing to the working of imagination. Imagination is anything but the truth. The experience that the soul gathers in terms of the individualized ego is all imagination, Maya, or ignorance.
Oh, Elizabeth, do you mind reading from here? You conflated a word.
I did.
Yeah.
Okay. Although the self is an undivided unity, it appears to be divided owing to the working of imagination. Imagination is anything but the truth. The experience that the soul gathers in terms of the individualized ego is all imagination, Maya, or ignorance. The objective universe. With the birth of the separate and limited individuality, there comes into existence the objective universe. As the limited individuality has separate existence only in imagination, the objective universe also has no separate reality. It is the one being appearing in the second role of manifestation through the attributes. When the one being descends in the domain of Maya, it takes upon itself the limitations of manifold existence. This self-limitation of the one being might be looked upon as its self-sacrifice on the altar of consciousness. Although it eternally remains the one being, it suffers timeless contraction through its descent into the world of time and evolution. What, however, evolves is not the one being, only the consciousness, which, because of its limitations, gives rise to the limited individuality. The triple entanglement. The history of the limited individuality is a history of the development of the triple entanglement with mind, energy, and matter. Duality prevails in these domains, and the individual gets entangled in this duality, although the self is beyond duality. Duality implies the existence of opposites, limiting and balancing each other through mutual tension. Good and evil, virtue and vice are examples of such opposites. The ignorant soul, enmeshed in duality, is in the clutches of both good and evil. During the evolution of the triple entanglement with matter, energy, and mind, the ignorant soul is under the influence of wanting. And it wants the good and evil of the physical world, the good and evil of the subtle world, the good and evil of the mental world. And owing to the distinction of good and evil, wanting itself becomes good and evil. Wanting is to be limited by the tension of the opposites. This tension causes oscillation from one state to another without arriving at the unlimited state. The infinite is to be sought. The infinite is to be sought for beyond the domain of duality, which is reached only when consciousness rises out of the limited individuality by breaking through the barriers of sanskaras. The chasm between consciousness and unconsciousness. We have said that the field of consciousness is limited by the sanskaras. This limitation creates a division of the human psyche into two parts, one within the range of consciousness, the other beyond it. The unconscious part in its full extent is identical with the power that is also behind matter. This is referred to as God in Orthodox religions. The one being, which is symbolically represented through such concepts, can be known only by bringing the unconscious into consciousness. An extension of consciousness consists in being conscious of that which was formerly unconscious. The progressive conquest of the unconscious by the conscious culminates in consummate consciousness, which is unlimited. Between this highest state of consciousness and the limited consciousness of average humanity, there are 49 degrees of the illumined consciousness. They mark the important stages of illumination.
Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. Back to Rosalie. Maybe we can each do 5 minutes now to close.
Spiritual advancement.
Mama arrived.
Yeah. Is that where I am?
Yep.
Yeah.
Mama
Okay.
arrived, honey
Okay.
bunny.
I'll take it. I'll take
Oh,
it.
oh, sorry. I didn't realize Mahu was here, Rosalie. So
Oh
let's.
no, you chose me for spiritual advancement. I have to go through with it.
Okay, go.
Spiritual advancement. The goal.
Then no bullying exists.
Okay, Rosalie begins. Spiritual advancement. The gulf between the clouded consciousness of average humanity and the fully illumined consciousness of a master is created by sanskaras. These can be removed through perfect character, devotion, and selfless service. Arid through the help. Now wait a minute. Oh, that's a typo. Arid through the help of a master. That means and through the help of a master. No?
Very good.
Yeah, arid.
Yes, and
Yeah, my God. Spiritual advancement consists not so much in the further development of consciousness, for it is already developed in man, as in the emancipation of consciousness from the bondage of the sanskaras. Although in essence, consciousness is the same in all the different states of existence. It can never be consummate until it reflects the knowledge of infinity without the shadow of ignorance and covers the whole extent of the universe, illumining the different spheres of existence. Deep sleep. Every time you sleep, you are unconsciously united with the one being. Bears repeating. Every time you sleep, you are unconsciously united with the one being. This unification thus bridges over the chasm between the unconscious and the conscious. But being unconscious of this union, you do not consciously derive benefit from it. This is the reason why when you wake from deep sleep, you become aware of the individual you suppose yourself to be and begin to act and experience exactly as you acted and experienced before going to sleep. If your union with the one being had been a conscious union, you would have awakened into a new life. Conscious union with reality. A master is consciously united with the one being. In him, the chasm between consciousness and unconsciousness is bridged, not by the extension of the unconscious over the conscious, as in the man who enjoys deep sleep, but by the extension of consciousness over unconsciousness. The waxing and waning of consciousness exists in the limited individual, but in the master, the conquest of the unconscious by the conscious is final and permanent. His state of self-knowledge is continuous and unbroken, and remains the same at all times without diminution. From this, you can see that the master never sleeps in the ordinary sense of the word. When he rests his body, He experiences no gap in consciousness.
Thanks, Rosalie. Mahu, do you care to read?
In the state of perfection, full consciousness becomes consummate by the disappearance of obstacles to illumination. The conquest of the unconscious by the conscious is complete, dwelling in the full blaze of illumination. This alone is illumination. As long as a person remains under the sway of duality and looks upon the manifoldness of experience as truth, he has not passed through the domain of ignorance. In the state of final understanding, there is realization that the infinite is the only reality, pervading and including all existence. A person who has such realization has attained the highest state of consciousness, in which the fruit of evolution is retained, but the limitations of samskaras are transcended. The limited individuality, the creation of ignorance, is transformed into the divine individuality, which is understanding. The illimitable consciousness of the universal being becomes individualized in this focus without illusion. One thus becomes the medium of the spontaneous flow of the supreme and universal will. Unimpaired by the separateness of Maya, the state of liberation in which there is objectless awareness, pure being, and pure being and unclouded joy. Such a one has no longer the illusions that perplex and bewilder men. In one sense, he is dead. The personal ego, which is the source of the sense of separateness, has been forever annihilated. But in another sense, he is alive forevermore in love and eternal bliss. He has infinite power and wisdom, and the creation is a field for the work of perfecting mankind.
We
Yeah,
could
that
either
changes.
stop now or we could continue with the element of sex.
It makes sense to stop now because it changes.
Very good.
Yeah,
I mean,
think
if
so
others
too.
agree,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
Amen. Amen.
So next week we start with Discourse 27, the element of sex, and that's on page 239, top
Yeah,
of
239.
239. Thank you so much for coming, everybody.